I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That was a shabby speech from Sam Lotoainga, because his side of the House have to take some responsibility for turfing 13,000 households out of state housing in the 1990s. That's what Sam Lotoainga's National Party did. In the 1990s, Mr Speaker, people lost their homes under National. 13,000 state houses were sold off. And it takes years and years, Mr Lotoainga, to come back from that kind of shabby policy. So don't lecture this side of the House about Michael Joseph Savage's legacy, because what Michael Joseph Savage stood for was actually looking after people, not turfing people out into the street like the National Party has a record of. This party on this side of the House stands proudly on its record on social housing. That side of the House has no idea whatsoever about what social housing is about, and we will not be lectured by Mr Lotoainga and his colleagues on that. Once again, Mr Speaker, the National Party has come to this House with a program of tinkering to try and solve a housing crisis, because that's what this is about. Yes, availability of land is an issue, Mr Speaker, but availability of land is only one small aspect, and it will not, Mr Speaker, deal with the greatest element of the housing crisis and the issue that the national government should be focused on in this legislation today, and that is the affordability of housing. Because Mr Lotoainga and his colleagues think that a $700,000 home 1 hour's drive from the Auckland CBD represents affordable housing. That's what Mr Lotoainga and the National Party believe, and that is wrong, Mr Speaker, and there is nothing in this piece of legislation that will really address the underlying issues around affordability of housing, because this government isn't prepared to roll its sleeves up and ensure that there are houses being built. That's what Labour's Kiwi Build policy is about. It's about actually rolling up our sleeves and saying, we'll get alongside construction companies and we'll make sure those affordable homes are being built. Because all this legislation does is set up some targets. It does not ensure at any point, Mr Speaker, that there will be affordable housing. All it says is the land will be there. It doesn't say anything about affordable housing. Labor has the plan to say we'll actually get that affordable housing. This, Mr Speaker, simply doesn't go there. Because they say how on that side of the House. It's really simple for my National Party colleagues. We build houses, 10,000 houses a year in the affordable frame. This side of the House, so Melissa Lee, tell me this, is a $700,000 house affordable? Is a $700,000 house affordable? 700,000 is affordable. Yes, she does believe that a $700,000 house in Auckland, an hour from the CBD, is affordable. It might be affordable for Melissa Lee, but it's not affordable for most Aucklanders, Mr Speaker, and that is what is missing from this piece of legislation. It's very important, Mr Speaker, to focus on the fact that what this does is set up special housing areas that will give consideration to affordable housing.
Order. I have a member on my left and a member on my right who are interjecting on each other, and they don't have the floor. It's totally out of order, disrespectful to the person speaking. The honourable member Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's important to note that what is set up under this legislation, under the accords in the special housing areas, is a process that will give consideration to affordable housing. It won't actually ensure that affordable housing is built. It'll simply give consideration, and that is typical, Mr Speaker, of the tinkering. There's a lot of talk about giving consideration to things in this budget, Mr Speaker. The National Party is going to give consideration to warrant of fitnesses for rental housing. They don't think they'll actually do it, they're just going to think about it. It's the budget about thinking, not about doing when it comes to housing, Mr Speaker. We actually need warrant of fitnesses for rental housing across the board. It may come as a shock to the National Party to learn that only 20% of children in poverty live in state housing. 80% of children living in poverty live in private rentals, and that is not covered at all by that. We certainly will be talking about that in the next bill. Mr Speaker, this bill does enable, once an accord is developed between central and local government, for a process to go in place that will see some fast-tracking and some streamlining of processes within the Resource Management Act. We are saying on this side of the House that we are prepared to see this bill go to Select Committee so that we can debate those issues. But, Mr Speaker, I give fair warning, sending a bill to Select Committee of this nature for a few weeks is completely unacceptable. If we are going to propose, or if the government is going to propose major changes to the Resource Management Act, to the way that the Resource Management Act is implemented when it comes to land, we need to know that that has been thoroughly debated, and sending it off for a few weeks will not make that happen. Mr Speaker, there may well be improvements that can be agreed on between central and local government in this area, but we are not going to be able to give that adequate consideration without a proper Select Committee process. Mr Speaker, when we look at the relevant bit of the legislation that covers this, what we discover is that the rights of appeal under this bill, when there is a special housing area established, will be limited to developments of 4 or more stories. Now, that fits in with elements of the Auckland Unitary Plan, and it's quite clear that the government has finally got around to working out that it should actually do something to facilitate the implementation of the Auckland Unitary Plan. But bear in mind, Mr Speaker, that this legislation will now cover the whole of New Zealand. It is not just about Auckland anymore, and therefore, if we're going to be deciding that the 4 stories or more limit is the relevant limit, we actually need to think about what that means in other parts of New Zealand. So it's all very well to propose to this House these changes when they're based on what happens in Auckland, but that's exactly why we need a full and proper Select Committee process so that we can actually analyse how this will have impact on the rest of the country. And the proposal from this, from the National Party today is to restrict that Select Committee process to a few weeks up to the end of July. And, Mr Speaker, I don't believe that that is acceptable at all. The fact is that land supply is only one part of the equation. And if National had a fully comprehensive housing policy that they were bringing to this Parliament, it would talk about far more than this. And Mr Lotoinga can't rely on the next bill because it doesn't do it either. It doesn't do it either. Because the National Party has been in denial about housing from the moment it came into office, Mr Speaker. The government has finally caught up with the fact that there is a housing crisis. Finally caught up with it after house prices have gone up by 36%, Mr Speaker, in the time that this party has been in office. 36%. But for the last few years, all we've heard from John Key is there is no housing crisis. And along the way, people in Auckland have been priced further and further out of the housing market. And, Mr Speaker, to come to this House with a bill that tinkers around, that says that, yes, we'll put some things in place that might allow there to be more development in Auckland isn't enough to make sure that we address that housing crisis. If the National Party was serious about addressing the housing crisis, they would add to this how to build more affordable homes, a process for doing that. They'd bring in place a capital gains tax, Mr Speaker, which they refuse to acknowledge on that side of the House. There's an important part of dealing with the housing crisis. They cannot see that why all but 2 developed countries in the world have a capital gains tax, but apparently it's a terrible, terrible thing for New Zealand to consider, taxing capital, taxing the National Party's mates. That would be a terrible thing to consider. A capital gains tax is an important part of a good, sustainable housing policy. Mr Speaker, the housing market has failed. Labor has recognised that with our Kiwi Build policy. National has come to the party very late with a bill here that will address one aspect of the problem of housing in Auckland, one aspect of the problem of housing across New Zealand. This is a bill that needs thorough debate, Mr Speaker. We are prepared to send it to a Select Committee because we believe it needs to be analysed. We are prepared to send it to the Select Committee because the government has finally caught up with the needs of Auckland and the fact that parts of the Unitary Plan need to be put in place. But we send it there with significant reservation, Mr Speaker, because this bill changes important aspects of the process of resource management approval. We want to have a thorough debate about those processes. Our support for this bill is not guaranteed past Select Committee, and the government needs to give serious attention to a proper Select Committee process so that we can get in place proper affordable housing policy. This bill falls well short of the mark of the kind of housing bill that should be coming to this House.
Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Holly Walker.